And this is where we left off. I believe we finished with this one and we're ready to move on to the next slide. A couple of things to remember or just to have in your head. We talked about Dalton's law as the sum of all the independent partial pressures. Actually the biggest pressure is nitrogen. So nitrogen has the largest amount exerts the largest amount of pressure, but nitrogen, which is the other gas in air that's coming in, is not the least bit soluble in water. So remember, it's the amount of the partial pressure of that particular gas plus its solubility. But carbon dioxide is far more soluble than oxygen, but the partial pressure of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen and water makes up the atmospheric pressure. In the atmosphere, oxygen, that O2, is about 21%. So you take 21% times the whole pressure of the of atmospheric pressure, you come up with 159 millimeters of mercury. That's the partial pressure of oxygen. That does go, so that's the number in atmospheric air. That does tend to decrease in mountains and increases as you go towards closer to the ocean. Get more O2 closer to the ocean. Another reason to go to the ocean. But inside, so that's atmospheric. Inside, the air is saturated with water vapor. So that actually shifts these numbers a little bit. So inside your partial pressure of oxygen is about, that's why we tend to use that word 100, so 105, but all of the pictures that I've shown you so far, it's given oxygen as about 100 millimeters of mercury. And that's why you have that difference between atmospheric and the air that you breathe in. As well as, in contrast, alveolar air is enriched in carbon dioxide compared to inspired the air that you breathe in. So if you compare the carbon dioxide levels, much higher. So carbon dioxide inside the alveoli is much higher than those that you breathe in. Well, those you breathe in are very, very, very small, actually, but because of the high capacity to dissolve in water. Just something to think about. And so henceforth, the partial pressure of oxygen in alveolar air equals the partial pressure of oxygen in blood. This is not changing temperature at a set solubility, which is Henry's law, as the solubility of gases in liquids, basically based on their partial pressure, temperature, and the ability to be soluble. So henceforth, the oxygen inside your alveoli, which is about 100, if you keep that number, it's going to be about the same as the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. And that facilitates the actual transport of oxygen. The other thing that facilitates the transportation of oxygen in blood are these red blood cells. So red blood cells are those biconcave discs that have no nucleus and have very few organelles. They have a few mitochondria, but they are just loaded, stacked with heme molecules. Heme molecules are 4 different parts with an iron ion in each part. So 4 different parts, iron ion in each part. Oxygen binds to that iron, so each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. And every red blood cell, each red blood cell has about 280 million hemoglobin molecules. You have probably that many red blood cells. So what you are with your blood is a lean, mean oxygen carrying machine. So you are carrying a lot of oxygen in that in those red blood cells. They are our chemical formula for the hemoglobin is Hb plus oxygen. You get this oxyhemoglobin molecule. Small amount is carried dissolved in the plasma. That's of oxygen. Carbon dioxide is transported in blood. Most transported in the plasma is bicarbonate ion. Small amount inside red blood cells, but as I said, that's on a different site, a different binding site. And then you have your hemoglobin molecule, which I knew this time, I knew this one was coming up. And just look at this, you have your iron. Your iron is depicted as little blue things, 4 of them. And you have 4 different protein chains. You have 2 beta chains and 2 alpha chains. Each of those irons can carry an oxygen. One of the things you want to put in your head, because it'll come up when we talk about fetal blood, those beta chains. In fetal blood, those are gamma chains. Those chains are different, makes fetal blood different, makes fetal blood have a higher affinity for oxygen than adult blood. The interesting FYI, I don't ask this, but I think it's very interesting, red blood cells don't use any of the oxygen they carry. Their metabolic activities are all anaerobic. They carry oxygen, but they don't use it. They have anaerobic activities. They do use glucose, so there is mitochondria in there. They use glucose, and they create a byproduct in that. Most anaerobic activities in the body do create a byproduct. That byproduct is part of what shifts the blood pH and has to be buffered. This byproduct of red blood cells using no oxygen, so an anaerobic process to create energy for themselves. The dissociation curve, this is interesting. I think in your book, or saturation curve, you can think of it either way, your book turns it into several different concepts. We put all the concepts together here on one graph. But what you find is that as the saturation goes up, so as the oxygen level goes up, so the saturation also goes up. But there are a couple of, so oxygen saturation, the partial pressure of oxygen is at the bottom, and that's going in a linear fashion from lower at the left to higher at the right. Saturation is going up the other axis from low at the left to high at the top. And as the oxygen partial pressure goes up, the saturation also goes up. The thing that would shift this to the left or the right would be, so shifting it to the left, so you have, I guess, a steeper curve, you might say. That curve's going to go up faster, is if you have decreased carbon dioxide, that's going to increase the red blood cell's affinity for oxygen. If you have decreased carbon dioxide, so partial pressure of carbon dioxide, if you have decreased hydrogen ions, if you have a decreased, you don't know what this 2,3-DPG is, but it's the byproduct, as I just talked about, of red blood cell metabolism. It's a you can think of it as like red blood cell lactic acid, a waste product of anaerobic respiration. Decreased temperature and then fetal hemoglobin is going to shift this to the left. The thing that shifts it to the right, so decreases the affinity for O2, so those red blood cells don't hold on to that or aren't in need of it as much. So that oxygen isn't really binding to the red blood cells as much as with the increased, is if you have increased O2, and that kind of makes sense. You have too much O2 in the blood, we actually must need oxygen for something. If you have an increased in hydrogen ions, which means your pH is lowered, so the pH of blood is about 7.35 to 7.45. If that pH goes more closer to the acidic way, you're going to have less affinity for oxygen. And if you have an increase in the byproduct of metabolism by those red blood cells and increased in temperature, you're going to have a decreased affinity for O2. We're talking about the red blood cells holding on to oxygen or dumping it off. And what you want to think about this is where would the body have needs for oxygen? The body needs oxygen if CO2 is increased. It needs oxygen if pH is lowered. It needs oxygen if temperature is increased. And then what happens that makes the body not need oxygen so that actually those red blood cells hold on to it. And then just a little bit more about what we just said is just kind of written out here. There is an affinity relationship between hemoglobin and O2. pH falls, less affinity, more loading, and vice versa. Temperature rises, less affinity, more loading, and exercise and fever are going to shift the curve also, where because the cells need the O2, you're going to have less affinity for oxygen in terms of the hemoglobin. Arteries, this is arterial blood, the saturation, and these are pretty useful numbers to kind of have in your head. To have in your head in a general way, arteries about 97% saturation of oxyhemoglobin, veins about 75%. Arteries in terms of milliliters of O2, and then veins milliliters less. So only about 22% of the oxygen that's being carried on the blood at any given time is unloaded, is dropped off for those cells to use. So you have an excellent reserve of oxygen, which is nice to know. It's one of the reasons why CPR can work if it does, that you have that pumping action that's actually moving the blood through the system a little bit, and as it moves through the system, it still has oxygen attached to those red blood cells. And I mean, the scenario here is a little bit nicer, that if you don't breathe for 5 minutes or you pass out or something, you have some reserve. You actually have a pretty good reserve there. On the other hand, some very strenuous exercise can load up to 80%. So going from 22%, which is unloaded in normal breathing, up to 80% if you've just completed very strenuous exercise or you're in the middle of strenuous exercise. Kind of an interesting bit of information, and at least to see the big picture in terms of arteries and veins and how efficient those red blood cells are at carrying oxygen, and the shift with regard to what gets dropped off is a good thing to have in your head. And here's your curve with regard to fetal hemoglobin. As I said, it's gamma chains instead of beta. And gamma chains cause that fetal hemoglobin to have a higher affinity than adult hemoglobin. And so that shifts the curve towards the fetal red blood cells. Even though the blood that's coming, the blood has circulated through the entire mom, or a good portion of the entire mom, and then it's going to the placenta, the oxygen, remember, there's still probably about 80% of the oxygen left on those red blood cells. Those fetal red blood cells have a higher affinity for that oxygen, so that oxygen is going to tend to move through the placenta into the fetal blood flow, and then up to the newborn or the developing baby. That tends to be something that I will ask you too about fetal hemoglobin, because it is something that particularly nurses need to know as you study your mother-baby program or your mother-baby class. And then the last thing we have to talk about is carbon dioxide transport. I probably won't have time to finish it on this one, but we'll try to get done as much as we can. We've spoken about this a little bit, but here it is written out. Most of it is carried as bicarbonate ion, some dissolved as CO2, some can be attached to hemoglobin, and you form this carba-amino hemoglobin molecule. We'll pick this up on the next one.